Rule 5. Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Actually, it's not okay. Recently I watched a 3-year-old boy trail his mother and father slowly through a crowded airport. He was screaming violently at 5-second intervals, and more important, he was doing it voluntarily. He wasn't at the end of his tether. As a parent, I could tell from the tone. He was irritating his parents and hundreds of other people to gain attention. Maybe he needed something, but that was no way to get it, and his parents should have let him know that. You might object that perhaps they were worn out and jet-lagged after a long trip, but 30 seconds of carefully directed problem-solving would have brought the shameful episode to a halt. More thoughtful parents would not have let someone they truly cared for become the object of a crowd's contempt. I have also watched a couple, unable or unwilling to say no to the 2-year-old, obliged to follow closely behind him everywhere he went, every moment of what was supposed to be an enjoyable social visit, because he misbehaved so badly when not micromanaged that he could not be given a second of genuine freedom without risk. The desire of his parents to let the child act without correction on every impulse perversely produced precisely the opposite effect. They deprived him instead of every opportunity to engage in independent action. Because they did not dare to teach him what no means, he had no conception of the reasonable limits enabling maximal toddler autonomy. It was a classic example of too much chaos breeding too much order, and the inevitable reversal. I have similarly seen parents rendered unable to engage in adult conversation at a dinner party because their children, 4 and 5, dominated the social scene, eating the centres out of all the sliced bread, subjecting everyone to the juvenile tyranny, while mum and dad watched, embarrassed and bereft of the ability to intervene. When my now adult daughter was a child, another child once hit her on the head with a metal toy truck. I watched that same child 1 year later viciously push his youngest sister backwards over a fragile glass-surfaced coffee table. His mother picked him up immediately afterward, but not her frightened daughter, and told him in hushed tones not to do such things, while she patted him comfortingly in a manner clearly indicative of approval. She was out to produce a little God Emperor of the universe. That's the unstated goal of many a mother, including many who consider themselves advocates for full gender equality. Such women will object vociferously to any command uttered by an adult male, but will trot off in seconds to make their progeny a peanut butter sandwich if he demands it while immersed self-importantly in a video game. The future mates of such boys have every reason to hate their mothers-in-law. Respect for women, that's for other boys, other men, not for their dear sons. Something of the same sort may underlie, in part, the preference for male children seen most particularly in places such as India, Pakistan and China, where sex-selective abortion is widely practiced. The Wikipedia entry for that practice attributes its existence to cultural norms favouring male over female children. I cite Wikipedia because it is collectively written and edited, and therefore the perfect place to find accepted wisdom. But there's no evidence that such ideas are strictly cultural. There are plausible psychobiological reasons for the evolution of such an attitude, and they're not pretty from a modern egalitarian perspective. If circumstances force you to put all your eggs into one basket, so to speak, a son is a better bet, by the strict standards of evolutionary logic, where the proliferation of your genes is all that matters. Why? Well, a productively successful daughter might gain you 8 or 9 children. The Holocaust survivor Jutta Schwartz, a star in this regard, had 3 generations of direct descendants who matched such performance. She was the ancestor of almost 2,000 people by the time of her death in 2010. But the sky is truly the limit with a reproductively successful son. Sex with multiple female partners is his ticket to exponential reproduction, given our species' practical limitations to single births. Rumour has it that the actor Warren Beatty and the athlete Wilt Chamberlain each bedded multiple thousands of women, something not unknown as well among rock stars. They didn't produce children in those numbers. Modern birth control limits that, but similar celebrity types in the past have done so. The forefather of the Qing dynasty, Geokanga, around about 1550, for example, is the male line ancestor of 1.5 million people in northeastern China. The medieval Yu-Neel dynasty produced up to 3 million male descendants, localized mainly in northwestern Ireland and the US through Irish immigration. And the king of them all, Genghis Khan, conqueror of much of Asia, is forefather of 8% of the men in Central Asia, 16 million male descendants, 34 generations later. So, from a deep biological perspective, there are reasons why parents might favour sons sufficiently to eliminate female fetuses, although I am not claiming direct causality nor suggesting a lack of other, more culturally dependent reasons. Preferential treatment awarded a son during development might even help produce an attractive, well-rounded, confident man. This happened in the case of the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, by his own account. A man who has been the indisputable favourite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror, that confidence of success that often induces real success. Fair enough, but feeling of a conqueror can all too easily become actual conqueror. Genghis Khan's outstanding reproductive success certainly came at the cost of any success whatsoever for others, including the dead millions of Chinese, Persians, Russians, and Hungarians. Spoiling a son might therefore work well from the standpoint of the selfish gene, allowing the favoured child's genes to replicate themselves in innumerable offspring, to use the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins' famous expression. But it can make for a dark, painful spectacle in the here and now, and mutate into something indescribably dangerous. None of this means that all mothers favour all sons over their daughters, or that daughters are not sometimes favoured over sons, or that fathers don't sometimes favour their sons. Other factors can clearly dominate. Sometimes, for example, unconscious hatred, sometimes not so unconscious either, overrides any concern a parent might have for any child, regardless of gender or personality or situation. I saw a 4-year-old boy allowed to go hungry on a regular basis. His nanny had been injured, and he was being cycled through the neighbours for temporary care. When his mother dropped him off at our house, she indicated that he wouldn't eat at all day. That's okay, she said. It wasn't okay, in case that's not obvious. This was the same 4-year-old boy who clung to my wife for hours in absolute desperation and total commitment when she tenaciously, persistently, and mercifully managed to feed him an entire lunchtime meal, rewarding him throughout for his cooperation and refusing to let him fail. He started out with a closed mouth, sitting with all of us at the dining room table, my wife and I, our 2 kids, and 2 neighbourhood kids we looked after during the day. She put the spoon in front of him, waiting patiently, persistently, while he moved his head back and forth, refusing at entry, using defensive methods typical of a recalcitrant and none too well attended 2-year-old. She didn't let him fail. She patted him on the head every time he managed a mouthful, telling him sincerely that he was a good boy when he did so. She did think he was a good boy. He was a cute, damaged kid. 10 not too painful minutes later, he finished his meal. We were all watching intently. It was a drama of life and death. "Look," she said, holding up his bowl. "You finished all of it." This boy, who was standing in the corner voluntarily and unhappily when I first saw him, who wouldn't interact with the other kids, who frowned chronically, who wouldn't respond to me when I tickled and prodded him, trying to get him to play, this boy broke immediately into a wide, radiant smile. It brought joy to everyone at the table. 20 years later, writing it down today, it still brings me to tears. Afterward, he followed my wife around like a puppy for the rest of the day, refusing to let her out of his sight. When she sat down, he jumped in her lap, cuddling in, opening himself back up to the world, searching desperately for the love he had been continually denied. Later in the day, but far too soon, his mother reappeared. She came down the stairs into the room we all occupied. "Oh, Supermum," she uttered resentfully, seeing her son curled up in my wife's lap. Then she departed, black, murderous, heart unchanged, doomed child in hand. She was a psychologist. The things you can see with even a single eye open. It's no wonder that people want to stay blind. My clinical clients frequently come to me to discuss their day-to-day familial problems. Such quotidian concerns are insidious. Their habitual and predictable occurrence makes them appear trivial. But that appearance of triviality is deceptive. It is the things that occur every single day that truly make up our lives, and time spent the same way over and again adds up at an alarming rate. One father recently spoke with me about the trouble he was having putting his son to sleep at night, a ritual that typically involved about 3/4 of an hour of fighting. We did the arithmetic. 45 minutes a day, 7 days a week, that's 300 minutes or 5 hours a week. 5 hours for each of the 4 weeks of a month, that's 20 hours per month. 20 hours a month for 12 months is 240 hours a year. That's a month and a half of standard 40-hour work weeks. My client was spending a month and a half of work weeks per year fighting ineffectually and miserably with his son. Needless to say, both were suffering for it. No matter how good your intentions or how sweet and tolerant your temperament, you will not maintain good relations with someone you fight with for a month and a half of work weeks per year. Resentment will inevitably build. Even if it doesn't, all that wasted, unpleasant time could clearly be spent in more productive and useful and less stressful and more enjoyable activity. How are such situations to be understood? Where does the fault lie? In child or in parent? In nature or society? And what, if anything, is to be done? Some localize all such problems in the adult, whether in the parent or broader society. There are no bad children, such people think, only bad parents. When the idealized image of an unsullied child is brought to mind, this notion appears fully justified. The beauty, openness, joy, trust, and capacity for love characterizing children makes it easy to attribute full culpability to the adults on the scene. But such an attribute is dangerously and naively romantic. It's too one-sided. In the case of parents granted a particularly difficult son or daughter, it's also not for the best that all human corruption is uncritically laid at society's feet. The beauty, openness, joy, trust, and capacity for love characterizing children makes it easy to attribute full culpability to the adults on the scene. But such an attitude is dangerously and naively romantic. It's too one-sided in the case of parents granted a particularly difficult son or daughter. It's also not for the best that all human corruption is uncritically laid at society's feet. That conclusion merely displaces the problem back in time. It explains nothing and solves no problems. If society is corrupt, but not the individuals within it, then where did the corruption originate? How is it propagated? It's a one-sided, deeply ideological theory. Even more problematic is the insistence logically stemming from the presumption of social corruption that all individual problems, no matter how rare, must be solved by cultural restructuring, no matter how radical. Our society faces the increasing call to deconstruct its stabilizing traditions to include smaller and smaller numbers of people who do not or will not fit into the categories upon which even our perceptions are based. This is not a good thing. Each person's private trouble cannot be solved by a social revolution because revolutions are destabilizing and dangerous. We have learned to live together and organize our complex societies slowly and incrementally over vast stretches of time, and we do not understand with sufficient exactitude why what we are doing works. Thus, altering our ways of social being carelessly in the name of some ideological shibboleth diversity springs to mind, is likely to produce far more trouble than good, given the suffering that even small revolutions generally produce. Was it really a good thing, for example, to so dramatically liberalize the divorce laws in the 1960s? It's not clear to me that the children whose lives were destabilized by the hypothetical freedom this attempt at liberation introduced would say so. Horror and terror lurk behind the walls provided so wisely by our ancestors. We tear them down at our own peril. We skate unconsciously on thin ice with deep, cold waters below where unimaginable monsters lurk. I see today's parents as terrified by their children, not least because they have deemed the proximal agents of this hypothetical social tyranny and simultaneously denied credit for their role as benevolent and necessary agents of discipline, order, and conventionality. They dwell uncomfortably and self-consciously in the all-too-powerful shadow of the adolescent ethos of the 1960s, a decade whose excesses led to a general denigration of adulthood, an unthinking disbelief in the existence of competent power, and the inability to distinguish between the chaos and immaturity and responsible freedom. This has increased parental sensitivity to the short-term emotional suffering of their children, while heightening their fear of damaging their children to a painful and counterproductive degree. Better this than the reverse, you might argue, but there are catastrophes lurking at the extremes of every moral continuum. It has been said that every individual is the conscious or unconscious follower of some influential philosopher. The belief that children have an intrinsically unsullied spirit, damaged only by culture and society, is derived in no small part from the 18th century Genevan French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a fervent believer in the corrupting influence of human society and private ownership alike. He claimed that nothing was so gentle and wonderful as man in his pre-civilized state. At precisely the same time, noting his inability as a father, he abandoned 5 of his children to the tender and fatal mercies of the orphanages of the time. The noble savage Rousseau described, however, was an ideal, an abstraction, archetypal and religious, and not the flesh and blood reality he supposed. The mythologically perfect divine child permanently inhabits our imagination. He's the potential of youth, the newborn hero, the wronged innocent, and the long-lost son of the rightful king. He's the intimations of immortality that accompany our earliest experiences. He's Adam, the perfect man, walking without sin with God in the garden before the fall. But human beings are evil as well as good, and the darkness that dwells forever in our souls is also there in no small part in our younger selves. In general, people improve with age rather than worsening, becoming kinder, more conscientious, and more emotionally stable as they mature. Bullying at the sheer and often terrible intensity of the schoolyard really manifests itself in grown-up society. William Golding's dark and anarchistic Lord of the Flies is a classic for a reason. Furthermore, there is plenty of direct evidence that the horrors of human behavior cannot be so easily attributed to history and society. This was discovered most painfully perhaps by the primatologist Jane Goodall, beginning in 1974, when she learned that her beloved chimpanzees were capable of and willing to murder each other, to use the terminology appropriate to humans. Because of its shocking nature and great anthropological significance, she kept her observations secret for years, fearing that her contact with the animals had led them to manifest unnatural behavior. Even after she published her account, many refused to believe it. It soon became obvious, however, that what she observed was by no means rare. Bluntly put, chimpanzees conduct intertribal warfare. Furthermore, they do it with almost unimaginable brutality. The typical full-grown chimp is more than twice as strong as a comparable human being, despite their smaller size. Goodall reported with some terror the proclivity of the chimps she studied to snap strong steel cables and levers. Chimps can literally tear each other to pieces, and they do. Human societies and their complex technologies cannot be blamed for this. Often when I woke in the night, she wrote, horrific pictures sprang unbidden to my mind. Satan, a long-observed chimp, cupping his hand below Sniff's chin to drink the blood that welled from a great wound in his face. Jomeo, tearing a strip of skin from Dee's thigh. Fegan, charging and hitting again and again the stricken, quivering body of Goliath, one of his childhood heroes. Small gangs of adolescent chimps, mostly male, roam the borders of the territory. If they encounter foreigners, even chimps they once knew, who had broken away from the now too large group, and if they outnumber them, the gang will mob and destroy them without mercy. Chimps don't have much of a superego, and it is prudent to remember that the human capacity for self-control may also be overestimated. Careful perusal of a book as shocking and horrific as Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking, which describes the brutal decimation of that Chinese city by the invading Japanese, will disenchant even a committed romantic. And the less said about Unit 731, a covert Japanese biological warfare research unit established at the time, the better. Read about it at your own peril. You have been warned. Hunter-gatherers, too, are much more murderous than their urban, industrialized counterparts, despite their communal lives and localized cultures. The yearly rate of homicide in the modern UK is about 1 per 100,000. That's 4 to 5 times higher in the US and about 90 times higher in Honduras, which has the highest rate recorded of any modern nation. But the evidence strongly suggests that human beings have become more peaceful rather than less so, as time has progressed and societies become larger and more organized. The King Bushmen of Africa, romanticized in the 1950s by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas as the harmless people, had a yearly murder rate of 40 per 100,000, which declined by more than 30% once they became subject to state authority. This is a very instructive example of complex social structures serving to reduce, not exacerbate, the violent tendency of human beings. Yearly rates of 300 per 100,000 have been recorded for the Yanomami of Brazil, famed for their aggression. But the stats don't max out there. The denizens of Papua New Guinea kill each other at yearly rates ranging from 140 to 1,000 per 100,000. However, the record appears to be held by the Kato, an indigenous people of California, 1,450 of whom per 100,000 met a violent death circa 1840. Because children, like other human beings, are not only good, they cannot simply be left to their own devices, untouched by society, and bloom into perfection. Even dogs must be socialized if they are to become acceptable members of the pack, and children are much more complex than dogs. This means that they are much more likely to go complexly astray if they are not trained, disciplined, and properly encouraged. This means that it is not just wrong to attribute all the violent tendencies of human beings to the pathologies of social structure. It's wrong enough to be virtually backward. The vital process of socialization prevents much harm and fosters much good. Children must be shaped and informed, or they cannot thrive. This fact is reflected starkly in their behavior. Kids are utterly desperate for attention from both peers and adults because such attention, which renders them effective and sophisticated communal players, is vitally necessary. Children can be damaged as much or more by a lack of incisive attention as they are by abuse, mental or physical. This is damage by omission rather than commission, but it is no less severe and long-lasting. Children are damaged when their mercifully inattentive parents fail to make them sharp and observant and awake and leave them instead in an unconscious and undifferentiated state. Children are damaged when those charged with their care, afraid of any conflict or upset, no longer dare to correct them and leave them without guidance. I can recognize such children on the street. They are deeply and unfocused and vague. They are doughy and unfocused and vague. They are leaden and dull instead of golden and bright. They are uncarved blocks trapped in a perpetual state of waiting to be. Such children are chronically ignored by their peers. This is because they are not fun to play with. Adults tend to manifest the same attitude, although they will deny it desperately when pressed. When I worked in daycare centres early in my career, the comparatively neglected children would come to me desperately in their fumbling, half-formed manner with no sense of proper distance and no attentive playfulness. They would flop nearby or directly on my lap, no matter what I was doing, driven inexorably by the powerful desire for adult attention, the necessary catalyst for further development. It was very difficult not to react with annoyance, even disgust, to such children and their too prolonged infantilism. Difficult not to literally push them aside, even though I felt very badly for them and understood their predicament well. I believe that response, harsh and terrible though it may be, was an almost universally experienced internal warning signal indicating the comparative danger of establishing a relationship with a poorly socialized child, the likelihood of immediate and inappropriate dependence, which should have been the responsibility of the parent, and the tremendous demand of time and resources that accepting such dependence would necessitate. Confronted with such a situation, potentially friendly peers and interested adults are much more likely to turn their attention to interacting with other children whose cost-benefit ratio, to speak bluntly, would be much lower.